Did everyone get that? Did everyone copy that down and write it? Because if not, I can repeat it from memory. Hands? Anyone? Does anyone else? Oh, okay, I got it from TJ. Again, it is hashtag A157E8. I look forward to your screenshots. So, good morning. At one point in my career, I would come home from work every night, sit on the carpet of my hallway, and I would cry. I wouldn't even make it to the couch of my living room. I just plopped down on that carpet hallway, opened up my laptop, and cried as I continued to work until fatigue and despair finally took over me and put me to sleep. I was crying because I was convinced that something was going to go wrong with the project that I was working on. That it would have turned out that I had accidentally corrupted production data without even realizing it in some irredeemable way, or that I would come across an error message that I just wouldn't be able to fix in time, and then suddenly the project stalls and it's all my fault, and that the only way that I could protect against all these potentialities was to keep working longer and harder until I could finally finish this project and just breathe again. And you might be thinking, okay, it sounds like I need sleep, which was true. I definitely needed sleep. Or that, I should talk to my manager about this and see if I can get some support. Or maybe that at my stage of my career, that this is like a normal thing to feel this kind of fear, and as you get more experienced, it goes away. Or that this is some classic imposter syndrome and I just needed some confidence to power through. But I can tell you that none of that was it. So how did I get there? How did I get into such a place of despair and being overwhelmed? Backing up a few months, my career trajectory looks pretty damn good. So I graduated from university at 19 years old with a degree in maths. I immediately got a job as an iOS developer where I worked on really chewy, hard technical problems like implementing an encryption algorithm. I'm not even kidding. I was reading math research papers and emailing people from NYU and Oxford trying to get answers until finally I was able to implement that math in C, no less. I still feel pretty damn good about that one. And I got positive reviews from my coworkers and all my performance reviews. By all accounts, it looked like I was doing pretty good. But this wasn't enough for me. So one thing to note about me is I am an ambitious, unabashed type A, right? I go after the things that seem a little bit too bold or daring to want. Because when I see those things, I'm like, challenge accepted. I'm going to show you that I can do these things. And not just that, but I was at this point of my career where my career felt like it was plateauing a bit. Like people would give me a feature, I would implement it. They'd give me another feature, I would implement it. And I'm like, what is the point? What does this add up to? So I set my sights on something a little bit higher. I wanted a promotion, and not just any promotion. I wanted to be a tech lead. Admitting this right now feels like a little embarrassing because I didn't want it for, the noble work of managing people and their careers. I wanted it because I wanted the acknowledgement and the recognition and respect that one gets from such a title. I was even so bold that when the position even opened up, I just went up and asked for it. And I didn't get it. Understandably, because I hadn't really done any grand scale technical project. I hadn't managed people before, so they told me I didn't have enough experience. Makes sense. So I was determined that I was going to prove my technical expertise. I took on the hardest project that I could find at work, this grand networking refactor where I would reach into the data models and the networking stack and the database, and I was going to clean all of that up. I started speaking at conferences, and then I started getting invited to conferences to the point where I had garnered this reputation of being someone who could take this hard technical thing and break it down into digestible, interesting pieces. I even read computer science textbooks in my free time, like that Big 4 design pattern book. I was like, I'm going to learn all of the architecture and be a grand master in this. And I read the structure and interpretation of computer programs, like that MIT textbook. Though, admittedly, I only got so far because the copy that someone lent me was this like gorgeous shade of purple. I like purple, in case you haven't figured that out yet. But this still wasn't enough. Like that chewy technical project, that networking refactor. I worked on it for 6 months and got it to the point where it was almost working. Everything was hooked up. All I had was like a few like race conditions that I needed a second pair of eyes on to help me like just get my head away from the weeds of it all. But then they canceled it without warning, and I was like, ow, oh, that's not cool. And then the like small opportunities to get experience leading people and like small project lead roles, I saw them being given to the new grads of the company. And not even that, to the intern. And I was like, ow, that really stings. And so I was thinking, maybe I hadn't managed my visibility well. Maybe it wasn't that I didn't have technical expertise. At that point, I was feeling pretty confident in myself that I knew what I was doing, but maybe people like forgot about me. Maybe I like just didn't pattern match with what they saw as like leadership material, because admittedly, I am peppy and bubbly and girlish, but maybe people look at leaders and they think, like very domineering and speaks up in meetings very often about like things of like a very deep technical nature, such as very strong opinions on which iOS testing framework to use and has a lot of presentations. And I'm just like, I'm none of those things. And then I finally got my answer. It happened in this one watershed moment of a day where I was walking back from the kitchen, mason jar of water in my hand, when a manager, he pulls me aside and says, "Do you have a minute?" And he takes me to a conference room, and not one of the like private conference rooms, but a conference room that has like 2 glass walls so that anyone who passes by and wants to see into it can definitely do so. And he sits me down and says, "So I hear you have a problem with so-and-so." And I'm confused because I'm like, I've never really worked with so-and-so in any particular length. But then I'm like, I had made a comment to like my manager like a week ago, and I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, no, I don't have a problem with so-and-so. It's, well, he's an intern, and I saw that he just got a project lead position, and so I wanted to know where I didn't have experience, like where am I lacking? And as he responds, I can tell he's dancing around something. There's something that he's not saying outright, but he takes a while to get there. He says that this intern is laser focused, and he brings up the project that I had worked on for 6 months, and it got canceled, and was like, "It seems like you haven't shipped anything in a while." And then he says that I ask too many questions. Someone who's vying for a leadership role shouldn't be asking questions, they should be asked questions. But I'm like still not getting it. I'm like, okay, and yes, what is it? And so finally, in this impromptu meeting in a fishbowl of a conference room, he gets to his point. He looks at me and he says, "Well, you're good, but you're not great." He implies that I have a higher opinion of myself than maybe is accurate. And I can understand that he thinks he's trying to help me, right? Maybe some people do have like a really high perception of themselves, and you have to like hit them with the hard truth. This is tough love. But that's not what it feels like to me. Instead, I just feel this like gut punch of devastation as I process those words. I feel my mind disassociating with the rest of my body, and my face just becomes this like blank mask of emotion. I perform the rest of the conversation in just monosyllabic answers because I cannot even like manage anything else than that. Because it turns out that all along, the little voice in my head that had been, something's wrong, maybe something is wrong with you, but something is wrong. It turns out that little voice had been right. In hindsight, I should have quit. I knew I was doing good work. I knew that I had value, but if the person who has influence over my career and my opportunities couldn't see that, couldn't recognize all the effort and all the extra time I was putting in, I shouldn't be there anymore. But I stayed. I enjoyed working with my coworkers. They had become friends, and I believed in the company and the product. Plus, again, like I said, I am ridiculously type A to a fault. So I was thinking instead, I am going to prove him wrong. But the problem was after he had said that to me, I stopped trusting myself because my opinion of myself was so dissonant with his opinion of me. And his opinion of me happened to have more effect on where my career went at that company. And so from that moment on, I started second-guessing everything I did. He said I asked too many questions, so maybe I should stop asking questions, right? Maybe if I ask a question, that reveals like a knowledge gap, and that further validates good but not great. Maybe I should stop asking for help. If I ask for help or try to pair with someone, maybe that shows I can't make my own judgment calls, and that, again, is good but not great. After a while, it felt like protecting myself meant just not working with other people, not putting myself in a position where I was vulnerable, where they could see the things I knew and the things I didn't and judge me for it. And this still wasn't enough. This person's opinion of me did not change. I mean, obviously, because at that point, my work had suffered. I was going so much slower and probably not as great quality of work. And at that point, coding just felt lonely and isolating and so unenjoyable. And so there I was on the carpet of my hallway, working long hours, crying because I just hated coding so much at that point, but continuing to work because it felt like it was the only way I could redeem myself to maybe eventually get through this rut and get some acknowledgement that I was doing something, anything right at all. So, why did I share this story? Why did I start your Tuesday mornings with such a bummer of an experience, right? Well, before I answer this question, I want to ask you 3 questions. Have any of you ever frozen up while tackling a new problem or code base? Raise your hands. Have any of you ever procrastinated on a task? Oh, okay, there we go. Everyone there. Or have you ever dreaded asking for help or asking to pair with someone? My point is that you're not alone. Everyone here has felt some degree of fear, whether it's a small scale fear or like my scale of overthinking everything. These fears are normal, and they're not just normal, they're okay to have. You don't need to shut off your emotions. You don't need to disparage yourself for having them. But at the time, I didn't know that. I didn't know how to process these fears, so instead, I kind of judged myself for my weakness and succumbing to them. Why can't I just power through my fears? I am a confident person. Fake it till you make it, right? I didn't know how to show compassion for myself and where I was at. Because if you think about the phrase, show yourself compassion, what does it actually mean to you? What comes to mind? It's like someone hands you this empty this protocol that says compassion with a function on it. Show compassion. And they're like, okay, if you implement this protocol, you'll be great. You'll be fine. And you implement it, and you're yeah, but what actually goes in it? What are the action steps? How do I know if I'm doing it right? What is it? And what's harder is that you can't just take someone else's implementation of it. Everyone has a different brain and context and history and environment and social identity, so that if you try to copy and paste someone else's implementation, it probably isn't going to work for you. So even though I knew that I could not stay in that place, I refused to stay on the carpet of my hallway. I didn't know what the answer looked like. I didn't know how to find my way out of it. But I knew what the problem looked like. I knew that one of the main sources of my fears was this fear of looking incompetent, of asking for help, of seeking guidance, of wanting to pair with someone, right? I had gotten this feedback that I asked too many questions and I relied on people. So I was like, okay, then I'm going to come up with like a whole thought process that is to like determining whether my questions were valid. It became like a whole calculus where I would think, okay, so I've searched these Google terms, which gave me these Stack Overflow results, which look pretty good, but trying to figure out what they told me, they gave me these error messages, which I'm not even gonna try to read this, but like, given the conceptual model in my head, it doesn't really match what these error results seem to say, so that means there must be a different conceptual model, but that means my conceptual model and the actual conceptual model isn't the same, so okay, I think I've reached all the avenues that I could do on my own, so maybe I should ask someone for help. But who do I ask for help? Who haven't I just like exhausted my quota of question asking with? Maybe that person, because he knows what code I'm working on. But last time I asked him a question, he sent me like this Wikipedia link, which was A, not useful, B, didn't answer my question, and C, pretty passive aggressive, so not him, so maybe another person. But this other person that I asked a question to, I don't think like she works in the part of the code base that I'm working on, so not only would I have to take her out of her context, but then she would have to like catch up on where I'm at, then that'll take a lot of time, so but she's nice, so maybe that'll be okay. But actually, am I really at my wit's end? Maybe I should spend like 1 or 2 more hours just like flailing until like my nerves are super afraid. And when they look at me and they see my eyes and I'm asking their questions, they can see the desperation. Maybe they'll take pity and be patient, right? I typed all this up so the captioner wouldn't have to. You're welcome. Did they try? Did they even try? Oh, they did. Props to them, okay. My point being that this is an exhausting place to be in, right? If you go through this every time you're about to ask for help or put yourself out there, you just tire yourself out. This is the way you get to burnout. And it wasn't until I came across this article called Musings on the Nature of Feminine Perfectionism by Hollywood that I was able to dig into my fear a little more. There's this quote I'm going to read. It's a bit long, so bear with me. The fact that you showed up with armor on at all tells me you're afraid, that you've been conditioned to see every encounter as an opportunity for judgment and assessment, rather than an opportunity for conversation, a potential chance for growth, a fleeting moment of mutual recognition. So breaking this down, she first says, you've been conditioned to see every encounter as an opportunity for judgment as an assessment. And as soon as I read these words, I was like, oh, that is so spot on. That is me, right? Working with other people had become a chance to fail their judgment because they would see where I was lacking and look down on me for it. So maybe it was better to not work with them at all. But what I love about this quote is if you keep reading, she provides an alternative way to look at this, right? She says, rather than judgment, this should be conversation. This should be a chance for growth. This should be a moment of mutual recognition. And so that was my first insight. That was my answer, that moments of vulnerability shouldn't be these moments of reckoning. They should be moments of growth. Because you ask for help, your teammate is able to help you. They're able to pair with you and show you a different way of looking at the problem, or teach you something new about debugging that you hadn't known before, or maybe just tell you some new Google terms that you could search. And so now, when I was feeling a fear of looking incompetent, I had a script in my brain that I could use. I could think, well, even though I'm feeling this fear, how might it be true that this moment is also a moment of growth? How might it be true that this moment is a moment that helps me? And what was great about this script was that I wasn't trying to turn my fear off. I wasn't trying to just power through it. Instead, I was including my fear as a part of my growth. It became a constructive moment, a positive one. The second of the fears that I recognized in myself was the fear of not just looking incompetent, but being incompetent. I was afraid that there would be a problem that would be outside of my definitive limits, such that no matter how hard I worked, I wouldn't be able to get there. I felt this fear show up in that project that didn't ship after 6 months of working on it by myself. I felt this fear in the features that just didn't end, the ones where you just like chop one bug down and then 3 more appear in place, and you're like, why? Why? I felt this in the career that didn't progress no matter how much I worked on it, that just didn't seem to add up and just plateaued. So I got in this mindset of, well, maybe no matter how hard I work at this particular thing, I'm just not gonna succeed. But I hate this kind of thinking. I would hate for this to be true. Like, I've received this on the opposite end, where people come up to me and they've like learned of my math degree and they're like, oh my God, that's so impressive. I wish I could be like someone who does math. I wish I was that kind of person. And in my head, I'm like, no, you are the kind of person that can do math. Everyone can do math. It's fun, sometimes. And so I had this cognitive dissonance between the belief of, yes, I can, and the results that seemed to say, but you haven't. It wasn't until I gave a talk on type erasure that I was able to bridge this gap. So the only reason I chose type erasure as a talk topic was because I was brainstorming some ideas with a friend. I am terrible at coming up with talk ideas. And she gave me this whole list, and I saw these 2 words, and I was like, I don't know what those 2 words mean. I bet other people won't either. Hey, that will be valuable. Hey. And it wasn't until I was like way too late to change my talk topic that I realized I have no idea what type erasure is. Oh my God. There were like, at the time, maybe 3 explanatory articles on the internet, and I'd be reading them being like, what is this code sample? Why are you doing all these things? What is this weird wrapper thing? What is the motivation? Why are we even doing this? Or not even that, they'd use like all these terms, like this is an algebraic data type, but is that the same as like as an abstract data type? And what about these concrete types? Like what are these terms? And so suddenly I had to read about type theory. Not just that, I also had to learn about the constraints of it and like how it didn't have covariance and contravariance. And I'm like, now I'm reading about language design. I'm like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this talk? I just could not understand it. But it was also way too late for me to change. I couldn't go back. I was stuck with it. And so I had to keep going and going. And this whole time, I was in this like mindset, this fixed belief that, oh my God, I'm just not very good at these low-level details. I'm the type of person that likes to see things like sparkle and bounce on the screen. That's my jam. But like the low-level details of the operating system and how the compiler works, I'm like, I don't really care. Like these details just never stuck with me. But since I had to keep going, I just kept working on it day after day until I got to this moment where I did start to understand it. Like, I did start to understand what a type was. Oh, that was the best. I was like, I have a definition of what a type is. And then I started to understand the code samples. I was able to like read them and be like, oh, I know when you want to use type erasure. And suddenly I understood things like abstract typing, concrete typing, covariance. And suddenly it's like, oh, I know type erasure. And it turned out that all along, my constraint hadn't been my aptitude. It wasn't that like I just wasn't the type of person that couldn't understand low-level details. All along, my constraint had been time. That I had never given myself the time to just like sit on these kind of problems and just chew and chew and chew. And then finally, I'm like swallowing. I'm like, oh, there it is. That's it. And this phenomenon of moving from like a static perception of your capabilities to one that's more flexible and plastic is what psychologists call the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. So, for example, if you come across a problem that's like maybe a little bit hard or maybe a little intractable, someone with a fixed mindset might think, this is too hard for me. I'm not that kind of person to do this. Whereas someone with a growth mindset might think, this is hard, but I just haven't figured this out yet. So here I had my second answer. I had another script in my head where every time I was feeling this fear of being incompetent, I could think, well, actually, my constraint is time, not aptitude. And maybe because of that, I could be okay with not doing everything perfectly. Sometimes you just don't have the time to refactor the entire architecture to make it the perfect thing that would be amazing for your feature. Or sometimes you just don't have the time to learn everything about operating systems that you don't know, and so it's okay to rely on your teammates to make up for it. That's what they're there for. And so I had built up these beautiful scripts in my head of how to deal with these fears. And as I learned all these new perceptions and terminologies, I also started to realize the limits of them, the caveats to thinking like this, which was there's only so much I can do to change people's perception of me. So even if I am feeling afraid of looking incompetent, but I'm still willing to put myself out there and be vulnerable, it doesn't mean that the people around me will make it emotionally safe to do so. They still might penalize me for things that don't deserve to be penalized for. And the same thing with the fear of being incompetent. Even if I can view myself with a mindset and be yes, I can, it doesn't mean the people around me won't view me with a fixed one, and that they won't limit my opportunities and how they sponsor me based on that. So I learned that I had to be aware of my environment such that I shouldn't disparage myself for what I can't change. I can change the way I react to things. I can change the way that I handle my fear, but I can't change the way that people perceive me. And the final caveat is that the fear doesn't go away. Even now, right now, as I'm working, if someone gives me a code review and says, this looks like it's a really great approach, maybe just fix these two things, I have to excuse myself to a conference room and just take some deep breaths, being I'm okay, I'm doing fine. He said I'm doing fine. He's not going to suddenly turn around and be you're terrible, right? I'm fine. And I sometimes wonder, but wouldn't it be great if I could just not feel this fear, if I didn't have all these emotions that I was just constantly being fraught with? But I don't think you should try to rationalize your way emotions. I think that these fears are all valid. If someone looks at me and thinks that I'm incompetent, or if I limit myself by thinking that I am incompetent, maybe I don't get a promotion. Or maybe I don't get acknowledgement for the work I do, or maybe I don't even get a job. Maybe I just fail all the interviews. And so instead of trying to rationalize away your emotions, the final thing that I had to learn in my journey of compassion was to appreciate my emotions and appreciate all the things my fear tells me. Because emotions are data points. If you think about it, your brain is this squishy black box of inputs and outputs of experiences and decisions, and your emotions are all just clues of what's going on. If you feel angry about this thing, well, that's an edge right there. And if you feel sad about this thing, hey, that's something else that you need to work around. Right? By taking your emotions as data points, you get to learn more about yourself. And by learning more about yourself, maybe you can leverage that to help you become the person you want to be. So what does my fear tell me? What should I listen to? I appreciate that my fear tells me when there's a gap between where I am and where I want to be. I appreciate my fear telling me that I am in a situation that I feel really unprepared for and uncertain about, and that there's something to learn here, something that I can keep in mind for the future. I appreciate my fear telling me that right now, this is terrifying, this right here, because I have just thrown a lot of vulnerability at all your faces. And hopefully, it's a moment of mutual recognition and conversation. And I appreciate all of you. I appreciate all the things that you have been resilient through, all the things that your fear has told you and what you've learned from it. And I appreciate all the space you've given me for my story and my emotions. And for that, I thank you.